All right. Well, hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Andy. As usual, I'm the events director of the Oxford Climate Society and a current master's student at Oxford studying environmental change and management. Just to give everyone a brief introduction to what the Oxford Climate Society is, if you don't already know, essentially we are a student society at Oxford aiming to develop the next generation of informed climate leaders. And we do that through a variety of different events, weekly speaker events, of which the one today is a part. We also run educational programs like the School of Climate Change, in addition to a student climate journal called The Anthroposphere. We also work with the university to develop net zero policies and to incorporate climate into Oxford curriculums. We're really excited for today's event, which focuses on environmental change and resilience in the Amazon. And we are super excited as well to be welcoming Alex Lucitante, Brian Parker, and Daniel Nepstad to be discussing this topic today. I'll give a brief bio to each of our speakers, and then we'll follow that with short presentations from each of the speakers, in addition to a Q&A section led by my prepared questions first, but then we'll open it up to the audience for your Q&A as well at the end. And so if you have any questions throughout the event, just type it into the YouTube comment section and we will get those answered for you. So Alex Lucitante is a co-founder leader and part of the Indigenous-led organization Alianza Ceibo. He grew up in one of the most lush and biodiverse rainforests on Earth, the Andean Amazon foothills in Ecuador. But unlike his father and his grandfather, Alex never knew a time before the oil companies and the miners and the loggers. Alex is now 27 years old. He has a wife and 3 children and is practicing to be a shaman. He's currently learning how to sing ancient healing songs and has the dream of being the first lawyer of his nation. He was instrumental in the Kofan people's struggle to protect their river from gold mining, a fight that became emblematic across Ecuador and resulted in a huge victory, shutting down 52 gold mining concessions and protecting around 79,000 acres of primary rainforest. Dr. Nepstad has worked in the Brazilian Amazon for more than 30 years and has published more than 160 papers and books on the ecological processes, the frontier dynamics, and the public policies that are shaping the Amazon region. He's a world authority on red and low emission rural development. He was previously a senior scientist at the Woods Hole Research Center, a chief program officer of the environmental conservation at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and a lecturer at Yale University. He holds a PhD in forest ecology from Yale University. Brian Parker is a senior attorney at Amazon Frontlines, which is an international group with the mission of supporting Indigenous peoples in their rights to land, life, and cultural survival. When Brian first came to the Ecuadorian Amazon region in 2009 to work on an environmental lawsuit against an oil company from his home state of California, it became clear to him that outside lawyers really need to understand that battles for justice aren't just about the law itself, but actually about joining a community and a nation's struggle for power. So since joining Amazon Frontlines and the Ceibo Alliance, Brian has had the privilege to participate in a number of Indigenous communities' struggles for power, listening, learning, and collaborating in any way that he can. So with that, I will just pass it on over to Daniel to start off his presentation. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much for that intro, Andy. And it's really a pleasure to be part of this panel discussion on such an important topic, and with such great panelists. And as Andy already mentioned, my history started a few decades ago in the Amazon in the mid-'80s. I moved to the far eastern town of Paragominas in the Brazilian Amazon, and I was there to do my PhD research on forest recovery and degraded pastures. And I feel like my steepest learning curve was learning about the Amazon frontier and how the mostly immigrants there were dealing with land conflict, with government subsidies to clear forests and put in cattle pasture, how the indigenous people of that region were dealing with this influx of outsiders. And I'd like to share a perspective that really goes back to some of those early impressions I had after doing about 20 years of manipulating forests, torturing them with drought and fire to see how they would respond in a changing climate and with the influx of people, to really shifting more towards some of the public policy solutions that could keep the forest standing. So I'll share now my screen with a few slides and try to keep this to about 10 minutes. And I am optimistic, and I think that that's key. Hope is a very powerful motivating force, and I think optimism is going to get us through. Quick comment on just why the Amazon should matter to people outside of the Amazon. It's I think I missed my key message. Oh, and that is that there are some Amazonians, and we're going to hear directly from Alex, and that is wonderful, who are deeply concerned about the forest, but there's some critical stakeholders who are in the Amazon who are not yet convinced that the case for forest-based, forest-conserving development is the most compelling one. And this includes governors, this includes farmers, and I think making that case is a critical part of keeping the forest standing. The Amazon forest carbon stock is equivalent to about everything all of humanity has emitted to the atmosphere over the last decade. This means that if we don't get it right in the Amazon, the chances of avoiding catastrophic climate change are significantly lower. And a forest dieback is already underway. That is not just deforestation, it's severe drought coupled with forest fire that are themselves causing that forest carbon stock to leak into the atmosphere. And a critical piece of that, of course, is the fact that in the Amazon, much of the rainfall depends on the forest itself. So if we get not enough forest and not enough rainfall, the chances of a tipping point become larger. We're dealing in the Brazilian Amazon, at least, with a remarkable history of success. Beginning in 2004, Brazil succeeded in slowing deforestation by about 78%, keeping about 7 billion tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere. And one of the issues that has been problematic is the forest carbon market never really materialized to compensate that significant contribution to the climate challenge. Only 4% of those emissions reductions have been compensated, and only a tiny amount of that has gone to the forest guardians of the Amazon, indigenous people and traditional communities. And the states also, who've done a big job in pulling the levers of change with law enforcement, et cetera, only 2 of them have actually received significant climate finance. So there's definitely a high performance, a high contribution that's been poorly compensated by the international community. The Pepe Sedan, the Amazon Plan for the Prevention and Control of Deforestation, a massive interagency plan launched under the Lula administration with Marina Silva at the helm of the Environment Ministry, was successful, but it was very heavy on sticks, on punitive measures, and very light on carrots. And it eventually, some of those gains in slowing deforestation have been lost. Since 2012, for example, deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon, which is where about 60% of the forest lies, has doubled, more than doubled. And this is despite the fact that major interventions were made to keep the Brazilian Amazon standing. The Amazon Fund, a results-based payment mechanism. If deforestation remains low, the money flows from Norway, from Germany, and a few other sources, has dispersed $1.5 billion into the Brazilian Amazon. There was the New York Declaration on Forests, in which hundreds of 2014, hundreds of corporate zero deforestation pledges, including dozens of companies that do business in the Amazon. We had the Brazilian soy moratorium of 2006 and the cattle agreement of 2009, all focused on slowing deforestation, but it has doubled. One important mistake I would call attention to, and we've written about this, is the lack of connection and alignment between the supply chain demand for zero deforestation beef or soybeans in the case of the Brazilian Amazon, and the farmers on the ground who are forced or required by law to keep 80% of their forest standing. If the criterion of success is deforestation and not legal compliance with the forest code, then you lose forest conserving farmers as advocates, as champions of this agenda. They're feeling silly or foolish for having kept, in some cases, more forests on their land than required, more than 80% of their land area. And if the market mechanisms are not recognizing and reinforcing that, that's a problem, and it ends up weakening the forest code. That's hugely significant in the case of the Brazilian Amazon, where 22% of the forests remaining are on farms, are in areas claimed as farms through the Forest Code's CAR registry. These are the forests that are literally right next to pastures, right next to soy fields, and they're in the line of fire. So if the forest code falls, and there's currently efforts underway in the Brazilian Congress to weaken or dismantle the forest code, the chances, the opportunity of keeping 80% or more of the forest standing become much smaller. Basically, we're getting into a very dangerous area in which the forest dieback, that drought forest fire interaction, becomes a significant threat to the region. The way forward, in our view, is really large-scale forest carbon finance. It is still, if you're a landholder in the Amazon today, your land is worth more if it has less forests than it is if it has more forests. And forest carbon finance is finally lining up as the net zero movement among companies are showing interest in the large scale comprehensive REDD, reductions in emissions from deforestation and degradation programs that have been built at the state levels as that funding starts to reach those programs. Mato Grosso and Acre are particularly important in this regard. Both of them have statewide systems for delivering support and bringing and giving a seat at the policy-making table to Indigenous peoples of those two states. Many of the Indigenous peoples we talk to are still very frustrated by the lack of finance actually reaching their communities. And it was impressive to me how, in response to COVID, some of the red finance that Mato Grosso had went to most, if not all, of the communities, the Indigenous peoples' communities in that state. But we also need a new narrative that's within the Amazon and not just internationally. Amazonians depend upon rainfall for agriculture, for transportation, for livelihoods, for fire control. And if rainfall becomes uncertain, that's not just an ecological problem, that's a cultural problem and an economic problem. And that fact is still not widely understood in the cities of the Amazon. So I think in general, we need a new narrative internationally that recognizes meaningful progress to slow deforestation, to recognize the rights of Indigenous people and get needed finance to rural communities and build those into trade agreements, recognize that the progress towards the goal of zero illegal deforestation needs to be recognized and rewarded to get to an 80% forested Amazon as the stable landscape. And I think just coming off COP26, we met with the state governments of 7 of the 9 Brazilian Amazon states, and every one of them is keen to take their programs and start to implement them for making the transition to forest-friendly development. Some are more advanced than others, but it does seem like we're in a great moment now where finally the agile finance could start to flow into these comprehensive programs. There's also many farm leaders, at least a couple thousand in the Brazilian Amazon, who are forest conservationists, and they want to be recognized for that. There's plenty of farmers who are land grabbers who are not real farmers, and other farmers who are not interested in forests. They want to rip them down as fast as they can. But there's this group of farmers that I think is a critical ally in this agenda. Indigenous peoples, traditional communities, and other local communities, including many smallholders, are also key allies in this process, of course, as is some members of the business community. So I'll stop right there, and thank you all.
Thank you. That was really insightful, and I have a bunch of follow-up questions, but before we get to those, Ryan and Alex, if you want to give your presentation, that would be great.
Dale nomás, Alex.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos acá en horas de Ecuador. Muy buenas tardes. Yo soy Alex Lusitante, soy defensor de derechos humanos y vengo de una familia de linajes de conocedores de la medicina ancestral, una familia de taitas que hemos vivido desde siempre en nuestros territorios. Ahora mismo me encuentro en mi territorio, que se encuentra ubicado entre la frontera con Ecuador y Colombia, y estoy como gracias a la tecnología que también ahora nos permite sentarnos desde aquí para conectar y poder como llegar lejos con nuestros conocimientos, hacer conocer, compartir. Me da como la oportunidad de ahora dirigirme a ustedes para compartir un poco de la situación que se está viviendo actualmente en nuestros territorios, ¿no? En sí, yo lo que quisiera ahora enfocarme más es en el tema de cómo en las comunidades indígenas estamos sintiendo el cambio climático, ¿no? Voy a ir un poco lento también porque creo que están haciendo la traducción.
Y Alex, mejor como tomar algunas pausas y tal vez dar un espacio ahora para que Elena pueda traducir.
Bien.
Yeah, so I'm translating for Alex. Hi, everyone. So my name is Alex Lusitante. I'm from Ecuador. Thank you so much for joining our presentation today. So I'm a human rights defender. I have lived in my territory here in Ecuador for a long time, and I have learned from the forest, different medicinal and other techniques, traditional techniques. My territory is in the frontier between Ecuador and Colombia, and it's from here that I'm joining you today. Thanks to technology, I'll be able to share the situation that is happening today here with us, with you. Thank you.
Desde que tengo memoria, ¿no? Desde que tengo conciencia de mi vida, de mi trayectoria, junto a mis abuelos, ahora mismo, cuando llegamos a entender sobre este tema del cambio climático, fui como analizando, fuimos dándonos cuenta en comunidad mismo, todos los cambios que se van sucediendo en los territorios.
Since I recall, since my family has been here ever since we started becoming more informed about climate change, we started to realize and observe these changes that were happening in our communities every day.
En la visión COFAN, nosotros tenemos ese conocimiento de los tiempos, de las épocas, que son muy importantes para la vida COFAN. Pero ahora, con todo esto del cambio climático que se habla, de toda la crisis climática que se viene viviendo, podemos sentir ya cómo el clima mismo ha cambiado, ¿no? Antes un clima normal, ahora se puede sentir demasiado calor, demasiado fuerte, el sol mismo. Se puede sentir cómo la época de las especies, ¿no? Van cambiando. Por decir un ejemplo, la época de las tortugas charapas, la época que ponen huevos, y quisiera contar esto un poco cómo funciona.
So the Kafan vision that we have is based on this knowledge of times and how the times have changed and how important this is for our everyday life. We feel the changes of climate change happening now in our everyday lives. We feel how the strength of the sun is changing, and the changes in the seasons. And for example, the case that I'm going to talk about now, on how the laying of eggs of different turtles, how that has changed, and we've observed that change.
En este caso, por ejemplo, sobre los huevos de charapas, para nuestros conocimientos de nuestros abuelos, por ejemplo, a mediados de noviembre y hasta mediados de enero son la época donde debería ser este verano, para que las tortugas charapas tengan como ese espacio para poder poner sus huevos. Ellos ponen huevos en las playas grandes, inmensas que hay en los ríos. Pero ahora vemos que todo esto va cambiando. Cuando es diciembre, cuando debe ser verano, ahora se presenta el invierno. Y cuando debe ser invierno, se presenta el verano. Y como hay estos cambios que realmente dan como una muestra de todo lo que se viene como cambiando a nivel climático. Y también bastante riesgos que las especies puedan estar perdiendo también, y el alimento para las comunidades también son impactados en ese sentido.
In the case of this particular turtle species, what we observe here is that usually the season for the laying of eggs happens from mid-November to mid-January, which is the summer months that gives this species the time to lay eggs. But recently we've been observing changes in the seasonality. So in December, when it should be summer, we have winter weather and vice versa. And all these changes create risks for the species, which we are quite aware of, but also for the communities that interact and kind of live from these changes.
Y lo mismo pasa con la época donde nosotros consideramos la época más buena para la pesca, y también al mismo tiempo la época cuando hay que cuidar como el tiempo de los peces cuando están con huevos. Pasa lo mismo. A veces cuando debe ser como la época de subienda, ya no es la época de subienda, ya no es verano, sino sigue siendo invierno, y a veces como los ríos aumentan de caudal, y finalmente para nuestras comunidades ya como que hay, digamos, no hay algo bien claro cuándo mismo es esta época o estas épocas que suceden, porque ahora el clima mismo cambia, ¿no? Cada rato, donde es la época de subienda, que es el mes de agosto, ya no suben en esa época, sino los peces también suben digamos, agosto, en septiembre, fines de septiembre a noviembre, como hay digamos, una trayectoria distinta a la que era antes. Entonces, es de esa manera como acá en la Amazonía se siente todo este impacto, ¿no? Y lo preocupante que es no solo afecta al clima, sino también a la vida cotidiana de las comunidades indígenas que vivimos acá en la Amazonía ecuatoriana.
We observe a similar thing happening for fish and their breeding grounds and the changing seasonality of this. So when it's not summer anymore, we don't see the changes happening between the seasonalities. We also observe changes in river discharge, which are quite worrying to us because it creates a lot of uncertainty since we cannot really predict anymore when this is happening. And this is how we are really feeling this and experiencing this from the Amazon. So quite worried, not just because of the climate, of course, but also because of the impact it's having on our livelihoods.
Sí, y también como todos estos impactos, nosotros lo hemos estado viviendo y como hay una cosa que nosotros creemos que es el camino para poder seguir manteniendo nuestra cultura, pero también seguir manteniendo nuestros territorios intactos, sabiendo que si tenemos los territorios intactos, pues hay cosas que todavía no se han cambiado y queremos que como por medio de nuestra protección, se siga como protegiendo la vida, se siga protegiendo la existencia, la riqueza de la selva, la riqueza de nuestra cultura mismo. Entonces es de esa manera que también quisiera tocar un poco el tema de nuestra relación con nuestro territorio, la espiritualidad de nuestras comunidades, cómo nuestra espiritualidad mismo nos permite a nosotros como pueblos indígenas proteger la selva, no solo porque es como o hay un problema mundial que es el tema climático, ¿no? La crisis climática que se vive, sino más bien también porque aquí es como nuestra vida y quisiera como compartir eso un poco más a profundidad también.
So the way that we see these impacts and the way we believe we should go forward, it has a lot to do with keeping our culture and at the same time keeping our territories intact and how this goes together, because it's a way of protecting life for us. And in particular, I'd like to go more into the implications that has for us as our community, our spirituality, the theme of our relationship with the land and how we need to protect this, not only in terms of the climate emergency that we're dealing with, but also in terms of the cultural and spiritual values that we attach to land.
Sí, para nosotros como comunidades indígenas, el territorio es toda la riqueza que existe para poder nosotros desarrollar nuestra vida. En nuestro territorio encontramos todo lo que necesitamos para alimento, para medicina, para construir nuestro hogar, en nuestras casas. También la parte espiritual. Nuestros abuelos nos han enseñado como esa parte espiritual también. Yo estoy en este proceso importante y muy bonito de poder saber un poco más la verdadera razón del por qué nosotros como comunidades indígenas estamos defendiendo estos territorios, ¿no? No es simplemente defender la selva porque los bosques están ahí, ¿no? Son árboles. Yo he escuchado muchos doctores, magistrados, de abogados del Estado, ¿no? De los ministerios que han dicho, pero si son árboles, no se trata de que son árboles y nada más, sino más bien conocer a profundidad como esa riqueza cultural y que tiene como una relación estrecha de manera como muy espiritual. Nuestros abuelos nos han enseñado esa parte de que las plantas sagradas como el yagé, como la ayahuasca, como le conocen a nivel mundial, son plantas que son como las plantas madres que a nosotros como personas, como cofanes, nos permiten conectar con la selva, nos permiten conectar con la espiritualidad de cada animal, de cada especie de la selva, para que nosotros podamos entender, generar conciencia en nosotros mismos y también generar conciencia en los demás para poder respetar esa vida que existe, esa riqueza que existe y que nosotros a simple vista no lo podemos ver. Simplemente por medio de la medicina podemos transportarnos a esa espiritualidad, a ese lugar sagrado donde la vida tiene que ser como bien cuidada y tenemos que ahí mismo respetarlo, ¿no? Para que sea bien cuidada tenemos que respetarlo, pero primero que nada entendiendo del por qué. Entonces, ahí vamos para la traducción.
Within our territory, we find everything we need. So we have our food, our medicine, the materials we need for our housing, but it's more than this. So it's the spiritual attachment that we have to land. And that is we're in the process of defending this. And it's only by understanding this richness and this value that we can respect and value the life. In this, I hear a lot of professionals talking about trees and the forest without really acknowledging that spiritual and cultural relationship that we had to the land and why this is so sacred for us, and understanding the richness that there is in every species. And that is what is key to us in our process of defending our territory.
Yo he escuchado, bueno, he visto, yo estoy siguiendo un proceso de profesionalización en derecho y me conmovió mucho, me dio mucho coraje cuando veía en una de las materias como de derecho ambiental, donde decía que se tiene que proteger los bosques porque así lo establece en la ley, ¿no? Cuando justamente hay un choque ahí porque nosotros no lo hacemos, no protegemos el bosque porque está escrito en la ley o porque tenemos que respetar simplemente lo que dice la ley, sino más bien tenemos que respetar como este espacio que está lleno de vida para nosotros, que está la mayor riqueza cultural, la mayor riqueza que al nivel espiritual no conocemos y que son fundamentales para nosotros como seres humanos vivir en armonía. Eso no se conoce a simple vista, se conoce por medio de la medicina, por medio del respeto de la selva mismo y por esa razón nuestras luchas en defender como la tierra, como la selva, los territorios, es sagrado como nuestra propia vida y que por medio de este mensaje que nosotros venimos a brindar con todo el corazón hacia el mundo, para que podamos nosotros como seres humanos poder respetarnos entre todos, entendernos y que el mejor camino sea el diálogo, ¿no? Y que podamos avanzar con esa visión, con esa mirada en que la humanidad necesitamos seguir en armonía, seguir viviendo para que todo pueda estar avanzando bien, que todos podamos unir una sola fuerza para vivir bien, como le decimos, no se canse, ya le decimos en Ngos, que no nos faltemos el respeto de unos a otros porque tenemos diferentes entendimientos, ¿no? Y desde ahí voy a parar ahí para que ayude con la traducción y quería compartir un poco de las acciones, ¿no? Desde la espiritualidad mismo, pero un ejemplo de cómo nosotros vamos aplicando ese entendimiento para defender los territorios y como parte de esa lucha que estoy mencionando.
So I'm learning law at the moment. I'm studying law, and it makes me very angry looking at environmental law, how it says we need to protect the trees and the environment because of the sake of the law and what the law says. And personally, we don't defend our territory based on what the law says, but because we need to protect the life that is embedded within this space and in our territory, because it is that cultural value that has been passed on from our ancestors and that you really only obtain through the medicine, the forest itself, and through that respect, and how that is sacred like our own life, and we need to respect that. It's not a matter of looking at the trees in itself, but the life that is embedded within it. And this is the vision that I want to put forward with, hopefully so that people can come together and live well in a way that not only respects the rainforest, but also respects this understanding, this spirituality, this cultural value that comes with it. And now I'm gonna introduce an example of how we can apply this going forward in the rainforest.
Sí, y es como yo mencioné, por medio de la medicina nosotros hemos logrado sanar como eso que nos han impuesto, ¿no? Desde la otra visión, desde el intento de desaparecer nuestras comunidades y de esa confusión en que hemos estado, ¿no? Personalmente hubo momentos en que yo sentía como un poco de miedo de ser indígena, un poco de vergüenza de de vestirme como soy, pero después logré entender por medio de la medicina que esto es lo nuestro y que todo lo que nos rodea merece ser respetado, merece ser protegido. Y asimismo, en la comunidad sinangüe se empezó como a llevar un proceso de defensa, porque este territorio de la comunidad Cofán Sinangüe, que es una comunidad, era una de las comunidades como más olvidadas también, como la mía mismo, empezaron a preocuparse del territorio, de todas las amenazas mineras, y finalmente ellos decidieron organizarse, donde yo tuve el honor de acompañarles también, con el permiso de ellos, ser su vocero también en los diferentes procesos. Logramos ganar una sentencia importante, una sentencia judicial donde cierra 52 concesiones mineras que iban a operar de 25 a 28 años, deforestando alrededor de 32,000 hectáreas. La comunidad, como pueden ver en la imagen, toda la parte roja, esas eran las concesiones mineras que estarían como operando, destruyendo uno de los ríos más importantes de toda la provincia de Sucumbíos, que es el río Aguarico. La comunidad decidió pararse duro, enfrentar, a pesar de todas las amenazas que puede llegar a recibir, decidió cómo enfrentarse. ¿Por qué? Porque ya no hay esperanzas en el Estado, no hay confianza en el Estado. Ya las comunidades hemos esperado por tantos años que el Estado pueda realmente hacer su trabajo, pero hasta este momento, a pesar de todas estas luchas y este gran ejemplo de Sinangüe, el Estado no está moviendo ni un dedo para defender la naturaleza. Sabemos que el Estado tiene compromisos internacionales desde la convención, que las firma, los acuerdos, pero generan ingresos por medio de esos acuerdos, pero finalmente eso nunca llega a las comunidades indígenas. Entonces, la lucha de Sinangüe en contra de todas estas minerías es un gran ejemplo. Y yo me siento muy feliz de ser parte de este proceso, de poder acompañar a la comunidad. Hace 2 semanas estuvimos en territorio. Llegó la Corte Constitucional para Desarrollo de Jurisprudencia, que va a ser una herramienta muy importante, no solo para Sinangüe, sino también para todas las nacionalidades indígenas de Ecuador. Ahí podemos ver, estuvieron también personas de todas las nacionalidades del Ecuador acompañando esta audiencia por medio de también participando o compartiendo su criterio mediante amicus curiae, y yo creo que esto es un gran triunfo para las comunidades indígenas, pero todo gracias al conocimiento de los abuelos. En las imágenes podemos ver que Graciela es una abuela cofán que canta muy bien. Todos los cantos de ella viene como de lo más sagrado, desde lo más profundo, donde ella transmite el mensaje, el dolor, la preocupación que viven nuestros territorios. Y yo creo que desde ahí, de esa voz, desde la palabra, se viene como ese amor a la vida, a respetarnos como hermanos y poder seguir hacia adelante.
So for me, at first, I was sometimes scared or embarrassed to wear my Indigenous clothing. But now I've realized that it's something that I need to own in order to move forward. And the example that I want to present you with is this one of Sinagoa, which is one of the more marginalized communities here in Ecuador. And what happened basically is that we had this community coming together, this Indigenous community, decided to organize themselves. And I was really lucky and privileged to be able to join them. And it was a great success because together they managed to win a legal lawsuit which essentially closed 54 mining contracts in the area. These mining contracts, which in the image were seen as the red territory, were next to the river Aguarico, which is a very important source of water. And if it wouldn't have been stopped, it could have led to serious environmental damage. So despite the threats that we received and the community received from the companies themselves and the lack of help from the state, because the state was really not helping our communities. Yes, they were signing international treaties and making different deals with different partners, But at the end of the day, that does not reach our communities and does not really benefit us, especially in this particular case. So this is why this is such a great example, and I'm so personally happy to have been able to be involved. And just 2 weeks ago, what we could see is that there was this Supreme Court hearing where we had a great sharing of ideas, different criteria, loads of different people coming together. But we really owe the success of this to our older generations, our grandparents, our parents, which are there present in the pictures. And it is through their sharing of their pain and suffering, through their stories, that we managed to materialize this into this great success that was winning this lawsuit and sharing our message with everyone.
Sí, yo creo que ya se me está agotando el tiempo, o sea, mejor dicho, ya estamos sobre tiempo. Solo quiero agradecer por este espacio y que todos estos procesos de resistencia que estamos llevando puedan ser escuchados en lo más lejos y pueda generar curiosidad y un poco para buscar a entender un poco mejor y se pueda como generar conciencia sobre la lucha de los pueblos indígenas. De mi parte, eso quisiera agradecer para que podamos respetar el tiempo también y me siento muy feliz de compartir con ustedes. Muchas gracias.
I think my time is over, and I just want to thank everyone for this space and being able to talk about this. And hopefully all of this resistance movements, we can generate curiosity and share it with people so that we can spread the voice about what is happening. So ultimately, thank you very much for hearing my presentation, and look forward to what everybody else has to say.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. Brian.
Thanks, Andy. And thanks, Alex and Daniel. My name is Brian Parker. I've been living in Ecuador for a little over a decade now, and working mostly in the Amazon, accompanying Indigenous peoples in their struggles and in their fights and in their lives. As Daniel really potently presented, the Amazon rainforest is approaching a devastating, well-documented ecological tipping point. It's one of the Earth's largest carbon sinks behind the oceans, but we know that it will be turned into a savanna by the end of the century if we don't stop the bleeding now. The driver of this deforestation is a global economic system that's premised on extracting natural resources from the Amazon. And we're, as it says here, bleeding dry the heart pump of the world, a rainforest that produces 20% of our oxygen, 20% of our fresh water, and contains 10% of all our species on the planet. And we're doing that for oil, for gold, for hardwoods, palm, oil, soy, and beef. All of these photos here are in or near indigenous territories in the Ecuadorian Amazon. But what's a little bit less well known, but is I think we've found equally devastating, is the cultural tipping point. The acceleration of forest loss from the oil roads, from the mining crops, from mining is threatening more than just the trees in our climate. It's threatening indigenous people's way of life and their ability to survive off of the abundance of the land. So the Amazon's most experienced guardians, like Alex and the Kofan, are being surrounded by destruction on all sides. And it's taking a devastating toll on their lives, on their cultures, and on their forest. And these are the factors and pressures that make it harder and harder for indigenous peoples like the Kofan, or like, as Alex presented, to resist and protect these generations for generations to come. And, so we can't just talk about the carbon stored or the hectares saved when we talk about the Amazon. The fate of the Amazon rainforest, and consequently our climate, because as Daniel pointed out, there is no solution to the climate crisis without protecting the Amazon. that model does not exist. And protecting the Amazon hinges on whether or not indigenous peoples like the Kokfan can continue to protect their rainforest territories and cultures from this growing wave of what are really existential threats. And, as the owners of approximately 1 million square miles of primary rainforest across the Amazon basin, indigenous peoples are in a really powerful position to permanently protect more than a quarter of the entire Amazon rainforest. Just to give you an idea, that's more than 4 times the size of the entire UK. And recent studies show time and again that despite all these pressures that they're facing, indigenous lands are still the best managed and the healthiest on the planet. And in the Amazon, indigenous territories fare 8 times better than non-protected areas in terms of deforestation rates, and perform significantly better than government-run national parks. Looking towards the future, the Sinangwe case that Alex discussed is a huge piece in all this. And it shows, I think, how indigenous peoples and why indigenous peoples are so much better situated to protect these forests than the government or than big conservation. The case that Alex mentioned hinges on the right to free prior informed consent, which gives indigenous peoples the right to consent over any decision, any project, hydroelectric, mining, oil, that affects their territories or their cultures, which makes them the only people who have the legal power to stop government-sponsored industrial projects that cause widespread deforestation on that level of a scale. But there's a problem, and the problem is that the story of the Kofan and the story of Alex winning against mining is the exception. It's not the rule. A centuries-long history of conquests and colonization has really stacked the cards against indigenous people, producing incredible inequalities across Amazonian countries. And even in Ecuador and in other Amazonian countries, the Amazonian provinces and areas are some of the poorest and in terms of government investment in the region and in the country. And so that leaves the Amazon's oldest guardians and best guardians under-resourced and without the capacity or the networks needed to effectively exercise their rights in the face of government manipulation, legal loopholes, and really powerful economic agendas. So at the end of the day, saving the rainforest, it's got to be about more than just protecting nature or storing carbon. It has to be about defending and upholding a way of life that protects and coexists with nature. Indigenous peoples never poison their own fisheries. Alex and his family don't make a habit of clear-cutting their hunting grounds. Indigenous peoples have defended the Amazon against innumerable waves of resource extraction for centuries with proven results. They are the collective owners of nearly 35% of the entire Amazon rainforest. And that area that's in indigenous hands is some of the healthiest forest in the entire Amazon basin in terms of wildlife populations, biodiversity, and forest cover. And we saw, again at COP26 this year, that large-scale environmental efforts all recognize the importance of the Amazon in fighting climate change and biodiversity loss. And more are recognizing the importance of indigenous people's role in being able to do so. But big conservation efforts have failed to invest time and energy in actually understanding the perspectives of indigenous peoples and how to most effectively support them in their ongoing resistance. This in a constantly changing world in the 21st century that is, obviously being affected by climate change as well. And that, that really has to change because we're not going to protect this forest and protect our climate and stave off, the sixth great extinction by land reforms or carbon markets alone. We're going to do it by transforming the way we live on our planet. And we, from the Western society, should start by listening and learning and supporting the urgent struggles of Indigenous peoples now. And that's what we've been doing at Amazon Frontlines over the last 10 years, really trying to learn how to listen to Indigenous peoples and how to partner with them in lasting and meaningful ways. And together with the Save Alliance, we've come up with a model and a plan to build power with Indigenous peoples so they can protect a way of life that protects the Amazon, and in turn helps, protect our climate at the same time. And what it says here is true. It can't all be about resistance. It can't all be about fighting all the time. Indigenous guardianship and Indigenous governance means supporting a wide array of areas of Indigenous life that are essential to that forest being protected. I could go into any one of these on the list, from cultural revival to solar panels to film and storytelling to food sovereignty, and explain in great detail why that's so important in this web of life in the Amazon and Indigenous life that continues to protect the Amazon. But I think the main message with limited time is that we can't give patchwork support to Indigenous peoples and expect them to fight the good fight forever. We need to listen to them. We need to understand their realities and needs, and we need to provide holistic, long-term support so they can continue living in and protecting these rapidly changing forest territories. So that's what I'd like to share. And again, thanks again for the space, and really looking forward to hear from your questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much to all of our speakers, Daniel, Brian, and Alex. That was really powerful and really informative and really insightful as well. I just want to dive, head on into responses to this environmental degradation and really just harp on something that you mentioned, Daniel, in your presentation about the carrots. And so, you talk about compensation for decreasing deforestation, but I'm just wondering, what does that look like from your perspective? Is that market mechanisms? Is it more private finance? Is it public finance? Obviously, we see with COPs that funding doesn't always materialize, even when countries promise that funding. And so I'm wondering what you think, the various roles are for the private versus the public sector, as well as just some of the carrots generally, if you could elaborate on that.
Sure. We're just coming off of a decade where there's more finance, more global attention, more corporate commitments to the Amazon than ever in history, and yet deforestation is rising. And I think one of the issues here is the speed and the bureaucracy surrounding public funding. Just as one example, the Amazon fund that I referred to, is administered by the BNDES, the Brazilian Development Bank, which is not really set up to do this. And so although the money has flowed, about 2/3 of that has gone to governments, including state governments. It's money that's almost impossible to spend. The government of Mato Grosso recently told me that they've had their grant from the Amazon Fund for 7 years, and have spent 60% of it because it's so hard to spend. The indigenous leaders in the Brazilian Amazon that I've talked to are also frustrated by just how the funding gets to them, and the speed of that funding, often in the form of boats, or in the case of COVID, there's been some delivery of COVID responses, test kits, masks, et cetera. But it's still not enough. And so I think what's really promising is the fact that the private sector is coming into this. There's plenty of bad forest carbon projects out there. And I think what for me is very promising is something called jurisdictional forest carbon projects, where there is a broad consultation among stakeholders. Everyone has a seat at the table, and it's really getting at the systemic drivers of deforestation and the fundamental issues of recognition of rights. Those those mechanisms are still not working through a forest carbon credit mechanism, but they are about to. We're in the middle of talks between companies and governments and other stakeholders that could really ramp up the speed and the amount of funding flowing. And what to me is really interesting is this money will not flow unless the free, prior, and informed consent is in place that Brian referred to. And I'm also struck by the fact that the communities want to see this happen. So I think it's a very important moment in history where we're not yet into this new jurisdictional type of forest carbon credit. And there's, like I say, plenty of bad independent forest carbon projects out there. And can this go to scale? And I'd like to think that hopefully it will.
So Alex and Brian, I just want to get your thoughts on what Daniel just said, and on pricing carbon credits in general, because we talk about a spiritual connection to the land as well as a cultural tipping point. And so I'm wondering to what extent those values can be commodified at all, and really put a price on. And so if that's something that you could give your perspective on, I would love to hear it.
Alex y Brian, ¿nos podrían dar su opinión o su perspectiva en lo que concierne a ponerle precio al carbono, estas finanzas de carbono, y hasta qué punto, como hemos mencionado, las conexiones espirituales y culturales, hasta qué punto ponerle precio al carbono puede llegar a reflejar estas relaciones también?
Dale nomás, Alex, y después yo te sigo.
Listo, muchas gracias. Bueno, como mencioné, ahora mismo, si nosotros ponemos un precio al valor del carbono, a pesar de todo, a pesar de cualquier manera que se le ponga un precio, siempre el que se va a llevar como el mayor premio siempre va a ser el Estado. Y finalmente las comunidades siempre van a seguir siendo excluidas de todo, ¿no? Y yo pienso que el mayor apoyo de cualquier organización, de cualquier estado, debería ser de manera directa hacia las comunidades indígenas para que pueda proteger en sí más que todo garantizar, más que proteger, garantizar la autonomía de las comunidades, para que esa autonomía, por medio de esa autonomía, las comunidades puedan como seguir protegiendo los territorios, puedan seguir fortaleciendo su cultura misma en el territorio y asimismo puedan seguir como sin dejar como ese interés, ¿no? Sin cambiar de pensamiento con pensar en otros intereses, porque digamos, si los pueblos indígenas llegan a encontrar ese interés, digamos, de negociar con empresas extractivas, la cultura se va a ir, se va a perder. Y cuando la cultura se pierde, pues el territorio también. Y si el territorio se pierde, también se pierde la cultura. Y como todo esto están ahí en riesgo mientras no haya una claridad de dónde se va como a apoyar y cómo se va a garantizar como estos derechos que se tienen o que tienen las comunidades. Pero por parte de, si ponemos un precio, como digo, si se pone un enfoque para garantizar como esta autonomía, yo pienso que podría funcionar algo. Pero desde ese lado, desde el gobierno, yo creo que ya han venido manejando muchos recursos desde esos precios, de esos carbonos, pero finalmente son para los bolsillos de los que están como autoridades allá arriba, digamos, al otro extremo, y nosotros como comunidades seguimos con nuestros propios esfuerzos realizando las luchas.
The way that I see it is that regardless of what price we give to carbon, the issue is that always the biggest stakeholder that is going to be profiting from this is going to be the state, and it's not really going to reach the indigenous communities. So in my view, the biggest way we can support our territories is by giving these resources and this money straight to the communities, because it's essential to guarantee the autonomy of our communities operating in our land. And this is important because us being able to keep our autonomy means that we can continue practicing our cultural practices and our values in a way that can be passed on to future generations. And we are not tied to any interests, not with the state and not with private companies. So of course, if there is a way of guaranteeing this autonomy through prices on carbon that could be written down and could be implemented, that would be great. But until then, and even then, I'm quite skeptical. I think the best way forward is just to go straight to communities, because the biggest stakeholder profiting from the carbon credit, as I see it, would be the state, not our communities.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree. And just to add, I mean, I think that the idea in theory is a really good one. Indigenous peoples need economic alternatives to oil and mining. The problem is that the market-based system has really benefited the people and institutions that are most adept at taking advantage of those markets and navigating those markets. And Indigenous peoples have often been left behind, despite the fact that they're doing most of the work, both historically and currently. But those are the funds that are essential. The funds, as Alex said, that should be arriving to communities to be autonomously managed by communities, to fund their land patrols, to fund self-governance, to fund community tourism products, et cetera. But in practice here on the ground, what we've seen is that the bureaucracy, the middlemen, the red tape make it really hard to see how, at least in the short term, carbon markets are actually really working for Indigenous communities.
And so, Daniel, I'm wondering, in your conversations surrounding things like the jurisdictional carbon forest credits, has there been any talks of what we just heard from Brian and Alex of funneling that money directly to communities? And if not, what would you say is the feasibility of something like that occurring, at least in your experience?
Well, there's a funny thing about the carbon market, which is it's much better at rewarding reductions in deforestation than it is in rewarding those who are keeping the forest standing. And, it's because of that logic that something like the Surui Forest Carbon Project, which was a project that went straight to the community, in the end didn't work. It didn't work because not everyone within that nation was on board with the program, and from my view, the problem is the logic, right? There should be rewards going to keeping forest stocks standing, and not just lowering the rate of their loss. There are, in contrast, two really great examples. I think we have a paper on our website in which we interviewed the Indigenous peoples of the state of Acre, who've been in a program for about 10 years, a climate finance program. Now, this is one that's not strictly credits, right? It's a results-based payment system, something recognized under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. It means that basically donations are made, and those donations go into jurisdictional programs. They're not managed by the state. They're managed outside of the state coffers. In that case, 80% of all funding went to the beneficiaries. And in general, I feel our conclusion from that study was that, and based on the interviews with Indigenous leaders, they felt like the main benefit had been that the program had given them a seat at the table. A second program, which we're in the middle of documenting right now, is that in the state of Mato Grosso, where there's 43 indigenous nations in 87 different territories. And there was a statewide consultation leading up to a $50 million results-based payment contract with Germany and the UK. The biggest result there so far for Indigenous people has been support around response to COVID. And we've not yet completed that investigation to see how the Indigenous people are seeing that program. So I think the important thing to comment is we're really early on in these programs. That is the more comprehensive programs. The money is not managed by the governments. I agree 100% that would be a problem. Even a lot of people in the government agree with that. And there's also, I should mention, there was launched here in California and around the Global Climate Action Summit, the principles of collaboration between Indigenous people and subnational governments. And today there's a working committee where there's Indigenous representation from each state of the Brazilian Amazon. There's a similar committee with Indigenous and local government leadership represented, basically to take the concept of free, prior, and informed consent, free, prior, and informed consent, and to implement that at a much larger scale. And those principles are there, they're ready to be implemented. In Ecuador, Pastaza has signed on to those, the province of Pastaza has signed on to those principles. It's still early on, and those have been remarkably difficult to fund. That is, that level of engagement and keeping those principles alive and getting implemented. So I think it's a very important moment for getting the benefits to Indigenous people that they need.
Yeah, and just to add on to that last point by Daniel, which I think is really important, is obviously a process to get the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples within these programs that is culturally adequate, that's at their rhythms, that's in their language. And I think one of the things that we've seen here in Ecuador, and I think Sinangue is an example of this, because Sinangue has been flirting with entering into the carbon markets for a number of years, is just a lot of times the failure to actually accompany and ensure, one, that the community is understanding the entire process and the rules of the game, but second, that they have the capacity and training and infrastructure to be able to succeed within those programs, and not 4 years down the line get hit with a fine by the government because some colonist invader entered into their land and chopped down a bunch of trees, or because of some other misunderstanding. I think that these one of the things that we've learned in Amazon Frontlines is how important and how time consuming and difficult it is to really accompany Indigenous peoples in these processes that are designed by Westerners within kind of what we think will work. But the reality in Indigenous communities is often very different, and the capacity and training of Indigenous communities in these type of projects often is nil. And so I think that that's something that really needs to be considered in the design of carbon market programs, is better, longer term, more involved, culturally adequate accompany of Indigenous communities so that they can really succeed within these programs.
So just shifting gears a little bit from the role of funding in carbon markets to the role of Indigenous leaders themselves. And so, Alex, this question will be directed to you, but how do you think your role as an Indigenous leader in Ecuador is, maybe different from what an Indigenous leader might experience in, for instance, Brazil or a separate region? Do you think that communities should focus on local governance and local matters, or do you think there needs to be some sort of cross-community collaboration and cross-community decision-making together? What are your thoughts on that?
Alex, le dirijo esta pregunta a usted y me interesa mucho saber de qué manera su experiencia como líder de su comunidad en Ecuador puede ser distinta a la de un líder en un territorio de, por ejemplo, Brasil o en otro lugar del Amazonas. Y si cree que las distintas comunidades indígenas deben concentrarse en gobernar localmente y crear proyectos en sus comunidades locales, o pueden o deben tomar decisiones junto con otras comunidades en otros lugares?
Hay dos factores como importantes que tal vez pueden funcionar bastante bien. En este caso, como mencionaba Brian, hay como comunidades que son distintos, ¿no? Son nacionalidades indígenas, pero su cultura es distinta, su idioma es distinto y su manera de gobernarse son distintos. Por el que yo pienso que cada comunidad tiene como su entendimiento, su propia cosmovisión, pero una cosa importante entre esas dos sería, digamos, en que las comunidades puedan articular estos procesos de lucha y de resistencia, porque sabemos que puede ser una comunidad tan pequeña como Sinangüe, sin el apoyo, sin el respaldo de otras más comunidades indígenas que viven las mismas realidades. Si no se comparte todas esas experiencias, siempre va a ser difícil defender como los derechos de los pueblos indígenas y también de los territorios y de lo más sagrado que existe y que está ahora mismo en grande riesgo de exterminio físico y cultural. Entonces, yo pienso que estos procesos de lucha, de articulación, son como importantes para que las comunidades indígenas puedan defender como sus propios derechos y sus territorios. Y yo pienso que aquí las organizaciones o las ONGs tienen roles importantes para poder como facilitar estos caminos, porque en sí, en las comunidades, como sabemos, no contamos con recursos, pero si hay como organizaciones que puedan facilitar estos caminos, yo pienso que a mí en lo personal, como ejemplo, me ha conmovido mucho yendo a compartir experiencias en la comunidad quichua de Sarayaco, en Pastaza. Ahí como sentí como esa necesidad, ese coraje recién de poder como levantar mi voz para poder acompañar a la comunidad y poder defender nuestros territorios y toda esta riqueza. Yo pienso que como compartiendo esa experiencia, articulándonos, va a ser como más fuerte la lucha de las comunidades indígenas, las nacionalidades, no solo de Ecuador, sino también de otros países, de otros países que estén como en la misma situación que nosotros y podamos articular de esa manera. Creo que es el mejor camino que puede haber.
I feel like there are two important factors here to consider that work well. And firstly, we need to realize that different communities will have different cultural practices and also different forms of governance. So they're not necessarily the same and they will govern locally in different ways. So each has their own understandings and their own practices. But also, on the other hand, it is important to share the way we communicate and articulate our struggles to save what is most sacred to ours. So that way we can defend our rights and share like these different struggles through our experiences and the ways that we have personally different movements, how we have managed to overcome certain struggles. And personally, I think the role of NGOs is really important here because they do carry out this role as mediators and facilitators in this way of creating these pathways for communication between different communities, for collaboration, to bring about these shared goals, even if it might be in different ways, these shared goals of defending our territories and defending our rights. And I have personally had this experience of going to other communities and feeling that need of having to share my own experiences and my own feelings to help them in their struggles, which to some level we all share in a way.
And so Daniel, about that, the role of NGOs that Alex just mentioned, and perhaps the role of the academic community more broadly, what do you think that those players' roles should be in assisting Indigenous populations and maybe where there could be more room for improvement?
Yeah, that's a big question. And, you know, I had the privilege of being with Chief Damian of the Chavanchi tribe in the state of Mato Grosso in the southeastern Amazon. This is about 10 years ago, and a little bit more actually. And when he shook hands with one of the neighboring cattle ranchers, the Xavante had recently been given some new land back. When they got there, there had been an orchestrated invasion of that territory. So they really could only use about 20% of it. And the game had been depleted. And but there was a group of cattle ranchers that saw that they were starving, and they mobilized, and they helped get, in the end, it was the army that went in and removed some of the invaders and squatters. And the cattle ranchers pulled together a herd of 500 cattle and trained indigenous Xavante to be cattle managers. And one of the feedbacks I heard about that was, well, Xavante should not be raising cattle. And I thought that was really interesting. For me, an example of indigenous people have to determine what they're going to do with their land. They have to, in the case of the Xavante, they were facing starvation because their traditional methods and dependence on game and subsistence cropping was not possible at that time. And I do worry that sometimes non-governmental groups want to come in and make sure that indigenous people fit their image of indigenous people, as opposed to what the indigenous people themselves want to define as their future. And I think the life plan processes that are going on around the Amazon, around the world, are fundamental in that sense, where each tribe is able to say, this is our destiny. And I think we run the risk sometimes of bringing in that bias and that sort of Western vision of what the future of indigenous people should be, instead of letting them determine that. So that would be my main comment there.
Just before we get into the audience Q&A, maybe I'll end on another pretty big question, but this one is really open to all. And so I'm wondering, does defending the Amazon entail a transformative, fundamental paradigm shift in our current economic and political model? It seems, such a grand problem. I'm wondering if the solution has to match that scale as well. If so, what might that look like? And if not, perhaps what are some of the other things that we might be able to do that fall just short of a paradigm shift, but would still be effective? And so, Elena, maybe if you want to translate that question as well, because it's open to all.
Esta es una pregunta que le quiero hacer a todos los invitados. Y mi pregunta es si creen que es necesario cambiar radicalmente nuestro sistema en cuanto a la estructura económica y política que tenemos para poder proteger el Amazonas. Y si es así, ¿de qué manera habría que cambiar nuestro sistema? Pero si no es así, ¿qué se puede hacer, si no es esto, para frenar la deforestación al ritmo que hace falta frenarlo sin un cambio radical?
That's a big question. Alex, ¿tú quieres responder o respondo yo?
Uno muy corto.
Yeah.
Y uno muy cortito. Nosotros hemos sido bien críticos en ese sentido. Como parte de la Alianza Seibo, que es una organización conformada exclusivamente por miembros de pueblos o miembros de nacionalidades indígenas, de 4 nacionalidades indígenas. Y hemos como sido muy firmes en ese sentido con otras ONGs que han intentado llegar a apoyar a las comunidades indígenas, y hemos siempre mantenido, sea quien sea el Estado o las ONGs que quieran apoyar con proyectos o iniciativas ya sea para defender los derechos o los territorios de las comunidades indígenas, tienen primero que nada no hacerlo en el escritorio, porque haciéndolo en el escritorio es un fracaso, porque no es un pensamiento ni un criterio propio de las comunidades indígenas, no es un camino que ellos están pensando en ese rato. Cuando lo haces en el escritorio, no funciona. ¿Por qué? Porque las comunidades indígenas tienen una visión, tienen un camino que están proyectando, y si las organizaciones no tienen acercamientos a las comunidades para entender cuáles son sus proyecciones, para la defensa. Va a ser como algo impuesto desde afuera, en el cual las comunidades no le van a poner el corazón en las luchas para poder sacar adelante las iniciativas, la lucha que quieran llevar. Entonces ahí es cuando nosotros siempre hemos dicho, si ustedes quieren trabajar con las comunidades indígenas, vengan a territorio, conozcan a las comunidades indígenas, conozcan la vida, la manera en cómo se desarrollan las comunidades en sus territorios. Ahí recién podemos entender y recién podemos construir algo bien fuerte para que nosotros, tanto como organizaciones o del mismo Estado mismo, puedan hacer algo bien fuerte para las comunidades, algo que realmente pueda ayudar. Caso contrario, siempre va a ser difícil, va a ser muy complicado que como una visión escrita en escritorio vaya a funcionar en comunidades indígenas. Solo eso nomás, vayan, disculpa que me fui de largo.
So I'm just going to make a small note on this, and it's a very important critique that we make from Sabo Alliance. So we are a group of 4 Indigenous nations, and we have quite a strong position of this, and we tell the NGOs that come in to help different communities that they must not carry out their projects from a detached position. They must not do it from their offices, from their institutions, because this will not agree with the pathways and the visions that the Indigenous communities have. So they will do it from a different point of view and from a different system. And this does not always align with what we project or what the vision that we have. And that's why we always tell these NGOs to come into our communities, to get to know the communities, to understand that it's a different system, it's a different vision. And it's only that way that we can move forward in putting forward the different measures needed to protect our territories.
Yeah, and Andy, just to add, and in response to your question, I mean, I think that we've seen over the last decade, especially, that Indigenous resistance and organizing and power is forcing the hand of the traditional power brokers and decision makers at the government level, but also at the NGO level, including the big conservation organizations that have usually been the ones kind of making decisions at a top level. And I think that Indigenous peoples are making it uncomfortable, which is a good thing. As we saw at COP26 this year, for those power brokers to maintain the status quo, and not just in the decisions that are being made, but in how and with whom those decisions are being made. And I think that's a big first step in shifting the paradigm. And I think that's something that we're seeing, more and more in a really positive way.
I would just add too, very quickly, I know we're almost out of time, but I think the world needs a new economic system, and there's no doubt about that. But we can't do that overnight. And I think we need a very pragmatic pathway to get there, including in the Amazon. And that involves using the levers of change that we have today at our disposal, the broader we, not me, but to really tame, destructive land use activities, recognize not just rights, but needs and rights to, not just land rights, but needs and rights to finance and to economic opportunities and the support we need for community enterprises to take off. And so there's a pragmatism, I think, that will have to prevail for some years as bioeconomies take hold and as we sort of tame the most destructive elements of Amazon land use. And I think the resistance that we heard about from Alex and Brian is a fundamental piece of that.
Well, with that, I will just bring it to the audience questions. I think we have time for around 1 or 2, but just really quickly, many activists criticize that Indigenous communities are not asked for consent, but rather consulted, with communities hardly being involved in decisions and instead just being informed of them. And so the question is, what are the legal differences between consent and consultation and how they manifest in the real world?
Muchos activistas, de hecho, cuestionan que a muchas comunidades, en vez de pedirles consentimiento, simplemente se les informa. Y me gustaría preguntar, legalmente, no y prácticamente, ¿cuál es esta diferencia entre simplemente consultar con una comunidad indígena un proyecto, un problema, y pedir su consentimiento?
Bueno, yo voy a responder esto así de manera muy sencilla, ¿no? En Ecuador la ley está escrito bien bonito, pero en realidad es tramposo al mismo tiempo, donde dice que el Estado, antes de ejecutar algún proyecto, tiene que consultar a las comunidades indígenas, pero al final dice, en caso de que no obtenga su consentimiento, se procederá de acuerdo a la ley, ¿no? ¿Qué es lo que esto quiere decir? Que yo voy a la casa de nuestro compañero X, toco la puerta y digo, ¿puedo pasar? Y él como dueño de casa me dice, sí, pasa, yo tengo, ¿no? Lo puedo pasar a su casa. Pero cuando esta persona me dice que no, no puedes pasar, porque no me siento seguro con tu presencia o por alguna razón no puedes pasar, yo no puedo entrar pateando la puerta. Y es lo mismo como se ha manejado el Estado. Y es por eso como la importancia, porque si yo, como dicen, si yo entro pateando la puerta, estoy poniendo en riesgo muchas cosas dentro de una casa, ¿no? No sabemos con qué intenciones vamos, ¿no? Y yo pienso que por esa razón es muy importante la consulta, esto que le puedo preguntar, ¿puedo pasar a tu casa? Y el consentimiento que esta persona me pueda decir, sí, sí puedes pasar o no puedes pasar. Y que ese consentimiento sea respetado. Si me dicen, no puedes pasar, ¿no? Por alguna razón, yo debo respetar ese consentimiento. Eso es lo que le falta al Estado ecuatoriano. No hay mecanismos claros, no hay protocolos claros sobre cómo hacer una consulta. Pero ahora podemos ver que el Estado quiere duplicar las actividades extractivas y también las actividades, digamos, en este caso la minería, y duplicar como la extracción de petróleo a 1 millón de barriles diarios. Y todo eso está en nuestros territorios y todavía no, en Ecuador no hay un protocolo claro para hacer la consulta y que tenga como único fin el consentimiento.
Pues yo voy a responder eso de forma muy clara. Y es que la diferencia en Ecuador entre...
Elena, sorry if you could, in English.
So I'm gonna answer this in a very simple way, and it's that this difference between consent and consultation is that in Ecuador, our law makes a very clear distinction between them. So it says that any projects that need to go ahead from the state, indigenous communities have to be consulted, but consent does not necessarily have to be given for it. So what this means is that if I, as an indigenous person, want to put forward a consultation, want to be consulted, or I am consulted by someone, and I go and knock on the door and want to have this conversation, the government or the enterprise can turn me away. So I can go and have that consultation process, but I will not be able to give my consent for this project to go ahead necessarily. So the difference is that whereas the law is quite clear on paper, there are no real mechanisms in Ecuador right now as to how I can go about making this consultation and giving or not giving consent, because at the end of the day, we can do the consultation, but whether or not there is consent is very unclear. And this is going on with mining projects and extraction projects at the moment, and there's still no clear way of how we can give consent after doing the consultation.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit. I mean, you know, in a lot of the cases and litigation that we move forward with Amazon Frontline, both with Sinangwe, but also with the Waorani and other cases, What you see in Ecuador is very similar to what you see in most countries, which is that the government will arrive to a community and they'll put a PowerPoint presentation up on the wall, and they'll talk about all the benefits that oil is going to bring to that community. They'll have a sign-in list, they'll give out lunch, they'll leave, and that will be the extent of their consultation process. At no point in most countries does the government ask, are you in agreement or not with oil wells or a pipeline in your territory? And that's the difference between consultation and consent. Consultation basically means that we're going to tell you about it, but we're not going to give you a choice in the matter. And if you resist, in most cases, we'll come in with the police and the army, and we will force you. Consent recognizes this historical debt and to Indigenous peoples for the history of colonization and the history of the imposition by the government and by Western society over them and their territories, and gives them the right to say no. And when they say no, that means no, and the project is over. That's really the main difference. And that's what's going to be decided in the next few months here in Ecuador by the Supreme Court in the case of Sinangue. In which cases, in which circumstances do Indigenous peoples in Ecuador have the right to consent? Obviously, Indigenous peoples are arguing for that to be applied in all cases. It's possible, unlikely maybe, that the court acquiesces, but there are certain cases where it's very clear in international law, in the law of many different countries, that consent is required. That is when the project might result in forced displacement or toxic waste, or could result in the physical or cultural extinction of a people, or could gravely affect some of their fundamental rights like water or food, etc. That's what's at issue, and it's really, I think, one of the most powerful tools, if not the most powerful tool, to protecting the Amazon that we have, at least in the legal sphere.
Well, I'm sure we could talk about this for, oh, sorry, Daniel, were you going to add something else?
I would just add, I think consultation and FPIC processes tend to arise in the context of conflict. And I think it's really interesting, the idea of just having a permanent governance structure where Indigenous people have a legitimate seat at the table in all of the decisions that are being made, including those that are not directly related to conflict. And that's starting to emerge in Mato Grosso, where the Federation of Indigenous People of Mato Grosso are in charge of the consultation process. And anyway, I think it's such a huge topic, and I think there's some interesting innovations coming online.
Yeah, I was just saying we could talk about this for hours and hours, I'm sure, but unfortunately that is all the time we have for today. I just want to say a huge thanks to all of our guests, Daniel, Brian, and Alex, as well as our translator, Elena, without whom, this event could not be possible. She's done an amazing job today. So just want to, say thank you to all of you, and to our audience, those of you out there still watching. Just keep an eye out for next term schedule. This is our last event of this term, but we'll have a full schedule lined up for you just in a few months. And so with that, I'll bring this event to a close. I hope you all have enjoyed it and learned as much as I have. But yeah, thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for organizing this. Great job, you guys.
Muchas gracias. Chao.